take a moment to introduce our guest today. Mr. Robert Wegener is an archaeologist and senior principal investigator at Statistical Research Incorporated in Tucson, Arizona. Mr. Wegener has been with SRI since completing his master's degree at Washington State University in 1998. He has overseen the completion of over 300 cultural resource management projects throughout the U.S. Southwest, including agreement documentation preparation, survey, monitoring, testing, data recovery, excavation, and/or tribal consultation support. For the duration of the 2009-2015 Luke Solar Data Recovery, which is the subject of today's presentation, he was the SRI project manager and principal investigator. He specializes in the pre-contact archaeology and ethnography of the U.S. Southwest and Great Basin. So with that, I'd like you to welcome Mr. Robert Wegener.
Well, thank you, Lisa, and thank you everyone here today for attending. Please know it's much appreciated, not only by myself, but also the staff at Luke Air Force Base and Statistical Research, the firm in which the work I'm going to share was done under contract with the Air Force. And before I start going through slides, I just want to give a very high-level recap of what we're going to cover today, which is what I hope to do is provide kind of like a timeline and story of how a very important 44-acre archaeological excavation took place at nearby Luke Air Force Base, resulting in the documentation of part of a much larger site that was occupied by indigenous peoples starting as early as 5000 BC and up into the 15th or 16th century. So, how did this all come to be as an archaeological project is where I wanted to start. And the way this project got initiated is via executive order. The Obama administration asked the Department of Defense to try and meet its energy needs, 20% of those specifically, 20% of their energy needs via renewable sources. And the Air Education Training Command, which is a command within the Air Force, for which Luke Air Force Base is part, chose to try and meet that requirement via the construction of a 107-acre, 10-megawatt solar array, which would provide not quite half the base's electrical needs, and that in turn would have met the command's entire 20% requirement. So they cited there was a portion of the base back in 2009 when this started. There was a 107-acre footprint between the flight line, munitions storage, and the south base perimeter that was the desired location to construct this solar array to meet this renewable energy need. That's how this all got started. This map shows us Luke Air Force Base right here with the orange footprint in the Phoenix Basin. By Phoenix Basin, that's this gray shaded area, and that's the hydrographic basin, internally drained area. And the locations of several previously investigated archaeological sites in the surrounding region. Some of the earliest evidence of maize agriculture, canal irrigation has been documented down in Tucson at these two sites down here, Las Capas and Las Pozos, starting about 2100 BC. Further down the Santa Cruz River, we've got Coffee Camp, a similarly aged site. There was work done at the Picacho Reservoir, US 60 when it was widened from Apache Junction to Superior. There are excavations near there in a place called Finch Camp. And then nearer to where we are today, there was significant work done in a place called the Cashin Complex, which represents what the Phoenix Basin is best known for archaeologically. The archaeological culture in the Phoenix Basin is best represented by the Hohokam. The Hohokam archaeologically are canal irrigation agriculturalists. They were using the waters from the Salt and Gila rivers. They were irrigating up to 40,000 contiguous hectares for maize, beans, squash, and cotton agriculture by AD 600 until about AD 1350. That's the archaeological expression that's most strongly known and documented, understood, and visible in and around us in the Phoenix Basin today. A lot of the artwork in the new overpasses and whatnot's Hohokam pottery, iconography, and basketry. So that's just south of us. Down here, it was first investigated by a man, the name of Frank Midvale, in the 1930s. Big agricultural village complex, primarily at that location, dating between about the 11th and 13th century. Just to the north is where we're at now, and near Luke Air Force Base. There were earlier projects at these places called West Wing and the Last Ditch site. Last Ditch in particular is important for the project we're going to talk about today, because it also resulted in the identification of really old archaeology. And what I mean by that is around 3,000 to 5,000 BC. It was a part of the Loop 101 expansion, is why it was done. It was ADOT sponsored. So we're in the Phoenix Basin. It's best known for the Hohokam archaeological tradition. Canal irrigation agriculturalists cremated their dead, made a distinctive red on brown pottery, participated in a regionally integrated ball court network, the Pueblo Grande Museum, and what's preserved there. This is a little bit of the regional archaeological context. I want to briefly talk about location, because location figures prominently in this story, and why what is preserved and why we have what is preserved at Luke Air Force Base and what we investigated in support of the solar array. What we're looking at here is a 1956 aerial. This is the flight line, the Luke Air Force Base flight line at that point in time. You can see a little bit of base infrastructure up here. The project area, and I hope it may be difficult to see. I'm using the mouse on the screen to show areas. The project area and the site that we investigated is situated between this flight line, the south base perimeter, which is approximately right down in here, and geologically these two salt domes. And this part of the valley was also mined for salt historically. But these salt domes produce these subtle topographic highs, the hills north of us. And as such, the water coming off of the White Tank Mountains to the west becomes impeded as it's working down through the valley, down the Bajada towards the Agua Fria River. And that results in sheet wash during the monsoons, depositing sediment on the landform, because that water is being slowed. It deposits fine sands and silts. The landform aggrades. It results in arable sediments, farmable sediments, which is what we're also seeing in this aerial with all these historical agricultural fields and the agriculture that happens in this part of the valley now. But 5,000 years ago, and I think this makes a good analogy, this part of the basin is also characterized by these little mesquite bosques, where you get these really dense stands of mesquite, little bosque. And these bosque are very important historically and prehistorically to the indigenous peoples of the Sonoran Desert, the Odom. Mesquite is easily collected in mass, processed and stored. It's a good complex carbohydrate, the relatively high protein content. It can be gathered by the entire family. It can be pounded and processed into edible cakes. that will store for years if properly, kept in stable conditions. So we've got a location on the landform where we've got a slightly degrading, a landform that's slowly degrading over time. We've got these, because of the salt domes, the regional geology, and we've got these little bosques. They're little in these photographs because of all the historic land clearance that has taken place at the time this was shot in August 30th of 1956. In the past, these bosques were, in all likelihood, much more extensive, much larger. How do we know there were archaeological sites there? The Air Force is a federal land manager, like any other federal land manager, the Forest Service, BLM, etc. Per federal statute and guidance regulations, is required to identify the cultural resources, archaeological sites in this circumstance, on the lands it administers, evaluate their significance, and determine if they're eligible for the National Register of Historic Places, and in turn try and preserve them if possible. And the way this is done is they support pedestrian surveys. They pay archaeologists to systematically walk across the lands that they administer, looking for artifacts and features that could represent archaeological sites. This was done on Luke Air Force Base in this 107-acre footprint over the course of 3 separate mobilizations and projects by different contractors for various reasons. The construction of the munitions storage area, flight line improvements, and also this proposed solar array in 2003, 6, and 10. That resulted in the identification of 6 archaeological sites, and when those are first encountered on the landscape, they're marked by, more often than not, artifacts, little potsherds, debris from the making and maintaining of flakestone tools, like scrapers and choppers, and the hunting toolkit, knives, and projectile points. And these little orange pin flags that we're seeing in this photograph are marking the location of individual artifacts at one of these sites up here at Luke Air Force Base in this 107-acre footprint. So before the solar array was even, before the construction of the solar array, was able to move forward, they knew they had these 6 archaeological sites, and there was also part of the historical Loma well in the project area. The well itself was there, the part of the pipe used to convey the water to the Loma itself. Dilapidated, broken in several places, non-functional at the time of the project. I think the intention was to rehab it. I don't know if that actually ever occurred. But those are the cultural resources that the Air Force knew were present and that are the subject of the rest of this presentation. So you got these 6 archaeological sites, first identified during pedestrian survey, marked by artifacts and little blowouts like we're seeing here. And by blowout, I mean these little pale colored, recently eroded areas, which is kind of a tip off. It's kind of like, oh, the only place we see artifacts is where we've got recent erosion. They're therefore probably much more present here over a larger footprint. So we know the archaeological sites are there, but what we don't know is their vertical extent, how deep are the preserved deposits, and what is the true spatial extent, the aerial extent of the archaeological sites. And there's a lot of technical terminology in here that I will apologize for now, but I'm going to try to walk us through this. Phase 1 is basically trying to figure out content and extent. How deeply buried, where is it buried, what's the overall spatial footprint of these resources in the location they want to build the solar array. To answer that question, we, in a cultural resource management context, which is what this is not an academic project. I mean, this work was done under contract with the purpose of clearing this area so the construction of the solar array could proceed. We use a combination of mechanical trenching, We use backhoes with a 2-foot tube bucket as an exploratory device, systematically cut trench at 15 to 30 meter interval. In this circumstance, at these 6 sites, that resulted in about 3,200 total linear meters of trench. That's about 1.5 miles if you add it up. And we also chose to mechanically strip about 2.1 acres in locations where we had lots of features exposed in the walls of those trenches to get a better understanding of the number, nature, and kind of buried features. And when I say feature, that would be things like prehistoric fire pits, the remains of prehistoric house foundations, the activity areas where people collected, processed plant and animal resources, and just where they led their everyday lives in and amongst their settlements and the work areas that were present at this location over the millennia. In this photograph, what we're also seeing, and this is part of that 2.1 acres of mechanical stripping, is we immediately started finding what archaeologists oftentimes call site furniture. But this is a big stone mortar. And as we'll see as we move through these slides, there were about nearly 6 tons of these were collected from the surface of this 44-acre footprint, all of which were shallowly buried within the top 18 inches of the sediment. So we had that slow grading landform as water is being impeded by those salt domes. You get that silt and that sand building up. That continued after these sites were abandoned, and these artifacts became shallowly buried within the top 18 inches of the sediments. We use this spray paint. This is marking paint like you see used by to like mark utilities and for construction projects in urban areas. These are marking the locations of suspected features, things like storage pits or fire pits. We are able to identify those locations based on their color and consistency. There was something within that circle that is normally like a dark grayish brown. The color distinguished itself from the pale yellowish brown sediment surrounding it. It's like, oh, that looks like a discrete area, potentially a pit. We'll paint around that, come back to that later and examine it further. This is a photograph showing that mechanical stripping process in action. We used these backhoes for trenching. We do step up when we get to this scale. This was a very large excavation, probably the largest in the basin over the last half century since they put in the interstates and Sky Harbor. At the end of the day, it was a 44-acre exposure. That's pretty unheard of since the 1970s. But this is just showing you part of the process. I mean, we have to follow dust abatement rules like everybody else. That's why we've got water trucks out here. But also, we're working adjacent to that flight line. We can't have foreign object debris impeding any of the operations of those jets on that flight line from a safety perspective. Another challenge with this project was, and we'll move to a map here in a little bit. I'll show where this is at relative to munition storage. Once we dug that original 3,200 meters of trench, stripped that at approximately 2 acres, found about 300 features, hundreds and hundreds of artifacts buried in the upper 18 inches for the most part, some extending down almost a meter, 3 feet. In consultation with the State Historic Preservation Office, the tribes, the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community acted on behalf of 4 southern tribes and took the lead in this circumstance on behalf of the Oodam speaking tribe. It was decided that, we had archaeology everywhere we dug within the footprints of those 6 previously recorded sites. We didn't find sterile areas to where there was no archaeology. It's like we need to continue this exploration effort to try to again, the purpose is to figure out the spatial extent, the number, nature, and kind of things present, and how we're going to go about actually excavating all that. So it was decided to do what was called intersite trenching, which was just continue the trenching program. We dug another 2,000 meters of trench in between the previously mapped site boundaries, and that resulted in the identification of more buried archaeology and resulted in combining 4 of those 6 previously recorded sites into one much larger site. And we retained the lowest number just for efficacy. And those original 6 recorded sites are shown here by these red polygons. The trenches that we excavated are the orange lines, primarily running east-west, so left to right. The areas that have been mechanically stripped up to this point in time are these gray shaded footprints within these earlier site boundaries. And then the features that were exposed in the trenches and during mechanical stripping are a combination of these little green and red dots in these trenches and stripped footprints. And this white line is the resulting combined boundary after this trenching was done through the center of the project area. And this is about a 44-acre contiguous footprint. The solar array was to be built within the limits of these black bounding lines. And these little arcs here on the east are the safety arcs centered on the munitions bunkers, which are just off the field of view of this slide. Nothing can be built, no permanent structure, no personnel are to be stationed on any regular basis within those footprints in case one of those magazines were to, God forbid, explode. And one complication of this, a complicating factor to run this excavation day to day is this road right here is the road that's used to carry munitions, everything from flares, 30mm shells, and whatever else you would put in and on a F-16 at this point in time. F-35s weren't bedded down here yet at the time of this excavation. All the munitions were carried back and forth on this road right through the middle of this excavation. And it's a very loud project area because of proximity to the flight. So all those touch and goes can be deafening. But so here's our 107-acre project area. It's arbitrarily divided into, what we're going to call it, area A and B by this road. And the bulk of our follow-on work occurred within the boundary of this 44-acre combined site area. There's one smaller site down here that we did do work on, and then a location up here. This is actually where we have the oldest remains from the project, dating back about 5,000 BC or out of this location. So this is the schematic. That trenching and stripping also allowed us to build begin the construction of a geologic model. Where's this archaeology actually buried in the project area's soils? And by mapping the stratigraphy and all those trenches across that 107-acre area, we were able to begin constructing like a 3-dimensional model on where all the buried archaeology was located, which is adjacent to and set in the fill of this old paleo channel that's heading over towards the Agua Fria River, but again gets impeded by the salt domes, resulting in that landform building up slowly over time. The only way to build a landform up here naturally is either the wind deposits the sediments or they're water. And in this circumstance, it's primarily water lane aggregation. The landform's building up during monsoonal sheet flow. So this allows us to zone in on where's the archaeology preserved, where is it preserved in the greatest frequency, and where do we actually have to dig vertically to clear that footprint archaeological remains prior to the construction of the solar array. We also did some radiocarbon dating of charred plant remains collected from select features exposed in the walls of trenches and in those stripping units that we would go in and manually excavate select features that we knew we had charred plant material in that would allow us to radiocarbon date parts of the sites. And this is where the project got a lot of people got very excited because we're going from, as we go up this vertical axis, this is the number of radiocarbon dates, 1, 2, 3, and 4, that correspond with a given age, starting with 3300 BC and ending over here on the side at AD 1900. And right here in particular is the big splash. Professional or academic archaeologists have been working in and around the Phoenix Basin and publishing the results of their work in one form or another since about 1897. And there are no, at least at the time of this excavation, there are no 3300 BC radiocarbon dated features in that archaeological record in the basin proper. The basin, again, is best known for the Hohokam, the descendants of the people who built and occupied this site and built these features and made these artifacts and used this location. But they actually have opportunity to examine and document what was the lifeway in what today is the Phoenix Basin, but the Sonoran Desert, I think, is a better characterization for this time period. 5,000 years ago is a big deal. Yes, it's not woolly mammoths at 11,000 BC, but we just don't know what Middle Archaic, to use archaeological parlance, populations, what that land use strategy looks like in detail. This was an opportunity to examine that. That later, and very important and impressive Hohokam archaeological signature is this stuff over here, post AD 700. Because if the Hohokam, to use Emil Howery's definition, are an archaeological culture that, again, produces a distinctive red on buff pottery, cremates their dead, participates in a regionally integrated ball court network, and are canal irrigation agriculturalists, that's not happening until about AD 650. So we've got all this data. We've got a handle now on where the buried archaeology is located within that 107-acre footprint. They want to build that solar array. We understand now that a lot of that archaeology dates between 3000 BC and about 81, which is a remarkable preserved record in the context of the history of archaeology in the Phoenix Basin. We came up with a data recovery plan based on those results on how to go about excavating that. And a project of this size and scale, it doesn't matter if it's archaeological or road construction or whatever it is, it's going to have fits and starts. It requires a lot of resources to do. There's fundings, negotiations, numerous stakeholders, the tribes, the State Historic Preservation Office, the Air Force, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, other entities, all got to get on the same page on how is this important, what's the best way to proceed with the excavation. Do we even proceed? Do we just bail on building the solar array at this location? That was at one point in time considered. The decision was to move forward. I mean, it has been built. It was plugged in I want to say August of 2015 and made operational. So the first phase, what we call phase 2, which is, okay, we know where it's at, we have a good idea of what it consists of. Now we're actually going to go in and dig these features, is phase 2. That started off with an additional 15 acres of mechanical stripping to expose things in plan view so we could get to the features. That resulted in identifying not quite 1,250 new ones. We dug 716 of them entirely by hand. at this stage of the project. This is over the summer. And we recovered about, not quite 10,700 artifacts or samples. And samples in this circumstance are like charred plant remains and be suitable for identifying the plants people were using for fuel, food, construction, but also for radiocarbon dating. Sediment samples for pollen analysis and to further characterize the site sediments. Residue samples from artifacts. There's a whole host of optical stimulated luminescence samples for dating when sediments were deposited. But that was the first tranche of what I would call the detailed excavation. And that 15.65 acres is shown here in gray. Each one of these little red blocks is essentially an acre. We used 2 of those large 300 series excavators, 2 of those paired with a 900 series gigantic articulating loader. We could strip down to about 1.5 feet, 1 acre in a controlled manner in 1 work week. But that's running like 10-hour days and staying on it. It's kind of a technique that was in some ways pioneered here using machinery of that size. The follow-on work for Red Mountain Freeway used the same kind of machinery for about 2.5 years, I think. After we demonstrated it could be done in these kinds of specific circumstances and not be overly destructive to the archaeological remains. So this is the initial round of detailed excavations. Again, the stripping is the gray areas, all these little red polygons and little dots within these gray areas are the locations of features mapped with a total station. The project demobilized at this point in time because of funding. And we stood down for about 6 months. This project was not without its drama because of its scale. The excavation actually was completed once the chiefs of staff from Senator Kyle and Senator McCain's offices at that time had an on-site tour along with an Undersecretary of State and other Air Force leadership about the importance of the archaeology, what would be required to actually complete this entire process, and how long that would take before they would have access to that footprint to begin constructing the desired solar array. Once that meeting was held, decisions were made to indeed continue the project and move forward. That whole process took about 6 months. There's a modification to the contract. The contracting was administered through Army Corps of Engineers Fort Worth District. We moved forward with the second round of data recovery, striving towards completion as soon as possible. We accomplished that between November of 2012 and April 2013. That's about 6 months. It required stripping an additional 30 acres. There was no surprise there. We knew that needed to be done from the trenching done the year before. We identified an additional little over 2,000 new features. So the grand total went up to 3,065. That's a big number for archaeological excavation in Phoenix Basin. We had 50 structures. I want to be careful about the use of the term structure. Archaeologists use that term a lot. 99 out of 100 times when an archaeologist says structure, what they're really talking about is the foundation of an earthen structure. Somebody came and they dug a foundation, an oval to subrectangular hole in the ground, that they then dug smaller holes in to set posts to create their walls, and they built up from there. What we find is the hole. We find the foundation. That's almost always what is meant by structure. We find the foundation, the earthwork for that house. Because the walls, that's wood, there's brush, and there's mud, and that all deteriorates. That's not going to survive for 2,000 years unless it's burned like a brick. We're going to see examples of this here shortly of these house foundations, but we didn't find any intact structures. We don't find the walls, the roof, or the entrances. We find the foundations, the floors, the walls, and the house pits in this circumstance. We had almost 3,000 extramural pits, and these are like cooking pits, storage pits, areas where they're processing plant and animal resources for storage, cooking, consumption. A lot of fire-cracked rock. This acronym you're seeing here, FCR, stands for fire-cracked rock. It's the result of using rock in your in fires. They did that for thermal mass. You heat the rock up and then use the rock as the cooking mass instead of having to continue to add combustible brush and wood to it. You heat the rock up, add what you want to heat up and or cook, cover it, come back when it's done. Middens, that refers to a discrete trash deposit, a location that people repeatedly return to dispose of domestic refuse, trash, and some other feature types. And we also recovered about 25,000 artifacts and or additional samples. I said earlier the big splash for this project was the early 3,000 to like 1,000 BC interval as being rarely preserved and poorly understood in the Phoenix Basin. These are examples of Middle and Late Archaic house foundations. These are the remains of like 3 to 4 meter diameter pole and brush structures built within a shallow pit. So the floor of these structures was subtly below grade at the time they were built and occupied. We know that because when we expose these with that excavator at first, we get these circular to oval ash and charcoal stained footprints that they're discrete. You can actually, here's one contiguous stain as you're mechanically stripping that down. That's the fill. We find these normally because these are structures that burn. They probably didn't burn on accident. They're probably intentionally burned. They become dilapidated, bug-ridden, and the easiest way to clean up the encampment is literally to burn that structure down. The remains of that structure, when we get encountered again, is ash and charcoal stained sediment. It's sitting in the depression and the hole they dug to set those walls and those posts. And we're seeing the remains of that with these, irregularly shaped circular to oval footprints. This structure is about 10 to 12 feet in maximum dimension, maximum interior floor space. You can see where the floor has been mudded a little bit, puddled. That's these lighter areas. And here in the interior, there's a storage pit in this back corner. You see a lot of storage within structures at this site, which I think is kind of interesting. It's commonly, the thought process amongst archaeologists was early on, storage is more of an extramural phenomenon and communal. You see the movement of storage into structures and into intramural spaces over time as site densities and population increases, very broad terms. This structure is particularly interesting because it's massive. This structure is about 12 meters across, so we're talking about 35 feet. That's huge. How do you put a roof on that using mesquite and pal verde? This is probably a large communal structure. It's got, interestingly, it's got these little hearths inside of it. There are houses documented very similar in construction to this, down along the Santa Cruz River in the Tucson Basin, but they're about 1,000 years more recent than this. The floor plan is very much the same though. But this is evidence of communal architecture around 3000 BC. Down here in the lower left This is a more typical, we're getting into 1000 to 800 BC, small circular pole and brush construction. This is Cienega phase. This structure dates to around 800 Cal BC, the very early Cienega phase in archaeological parlance for this area. And then we're surprised to see a square floor plan. I don't think this was fully walled and roofed. I think this is a really robust Ramada-like structure, is the way it was ultimately interpreted. But it's in this 3,000 to 800 BC group of houses. And you can see the identification process well. To go back up to this photo in the top right, this structure was found by the excavation of this trench. About a year beforehand, and we were able to identify it in the profile of the wall of the trench. We knew how far below the surface it was buried, so we could come in mechanically strip right down to it, preserve as much of the fill and as much of the remaining structure as possible, and to dig the remainder by hand, which is what's happening with these group of archaeologists in the background here. They're digging an adjacent structure back here. There's another one right next to it, but it's about a third the size. This is an early Hohokam house. Let's say that for a number of reasons. One is the way the house is constructed. It's got a perimeter. It's a small subrectangular to ovate floor plan. This is the interior floor. This is the hearth. You've got a perimeter floor groove. So they dug the house pit. Along the interior edge of that pit, they dug a perimeter groove in which they then dug holes to set their posts. There's a sill plate. This is the hole for where you'd have a wooden slab or a tabular stone at the junction between the interior of the structure and its entryway, probably to keep sheet wash and dust and promote cleanliness of the interior. And you've got this protruding entryway with two little wing walls coming off near the center of the long axis, the center of the front wall. That's a very Hohokam floor plan. This has been documented thousands of times. This is very commonplace in the Hohokam archaeological literature. And the radiocarbon date's consistent. This one comes in around 8,500. This is the following Hohokam phase. So we have all the early stuff. We also have Hohokam stuff here. That's one of the interesting things about this site is we got this intermittent use from 3000 BC all the way up into this like 1600. You got this 5,000 year record of repeated, return to, use of, and at times habitation, living at this location. These are the remains of some Snaketown phase Hohokam structures, delineated primarily in this circumstance by the perimeter post holes that were used to hold up the wall posts. And you see some reoccupation. I think this is probably some kind of serial reoccupation. You got this structure, it's probably the first one. Built, used, occupied, abandoned. Maybe they yanked the posts out of it, built this smaller one adjacent to it and overlapping with the earlier footprint. You have an intramural pit here, some kind of storage pit in the interior. This bigger one, because of the floor size, they were putting in some central supports to uphold the roof. That's what these are, a little two-poster. This one's small enough they're probably able to breach the roof just by bowing over the wall posts and lashing them together on the top. So we have house foundations. So the sites, the people are investing, they're there long enough that they're making the decision to construct houses. They're probably there at times for weeks, perhaps months. Perhaps they're seasonal. That's what I think those houses, the construction of those houses represents. But they're not always staying there for that length of time. I think the site is probably most often used by small task groups from people living in adjacent villages near the Agua Fria River or the Gila. They're coming up into this area to collect plant resources, process them, and return to their parent village, put them in the surrounding landscape. But when they're doing that, they are building and using a lot of fire pits. of those like 3,000 extramural features, the features outside the houses, the bulk of them are either small roasting pits like this that are full of this fire-cracked rock, and this one is one that they used it, they started a fire in it, they loaded it with stuff, they didn't come back and empty it out. We did several thousand years later, which is evidenced by this pile we've taken out. It's good that we have these because we can date these because of the chart plant material that's in them. But there are many hundreds of these distributed across that 44-acre strip footprint. So this is a very common feature type. On the early end, there are bell-shaped pits, and these are pits that if you were to section and cut them vertically, they have a vertical little neck, like an oil. They come down and open up into like a bell. They look like a buried oil. That's one way to think of it. And these tend to be early. These tend to predate the use of ceramics. They tend to be a late archaic, early agricultural, earlier kind of pit. They're used for storage. They can be several meters in volume. The individual who's in that pit with the black ball cap is over 6 feet tall. He's kneeling. But he's not a small individual. And that pit's only half excavated at the time of this photograph. This is a line just used to cut it in half horizontally, and he's in one half of that pit. So when that was fully excavated, it's several cubic meters in volume. It's a feature that you could have stored a significant amount of foodstuffs or other materials in, covered, obscured, come back to at a later time. Caching. We talked earlier about all this groundstone, shallowly buried in the site sediments, that we had about 6 metric tons of it. By groundstone, I mean metates, monos, grinding equipment to be used for grinding and processing small hard seeds and other plant foods, but also a lot of pounding equipment, mortars and pestles that would be used to process those mesquite pods. So we have the nearby adjacent bosque. We have lots of evidence of mesquite from the chart, mesquite pods, and beans from the preserved plant remains recovered from a lot of these features. And going along with that whole little package, if you will, is this tremendous amount of groundstone. Every large rock in this photograph, there's one back here. These are little hand stones for like monos for grinding on a metate or a grinding slick. Right here's a pestle, that's a pounding tool. We've got the fragments of metates here. This lower photo, here's a great big pestle. That's a big two-handed pestle. It's about 18 inches long, about 5 inches in diameter. It's a two-handed stone pounding tool. Not all the mortars, the basins that pestle would be used in would have been stone. Some of them are probably wood. Ethnographically, there are numerous examples of mesquite and ironwood mortar basins. Here's another pestle down here. So, we had hundreds of these during the mechanical stripping, and then others recovered from inside many of the pits. So they're being left out on the site surface, being buried after the site's been abandoned for hundreds of years there, thousands or hundreds of years thereafter. Some of them get buried. Some of them are also being intentionally cached in some of those pits. So this is intent to revisit. I mean, these rocks don't naturally occur here. They had to carry these in. You're down on the distal Bahada, the alluvial fan coming off the white tanks. Geologically, that stuff's not being moved in there. People are bringing that all in there from elsewhere and then caching it to use it at a later time. So we have intentionality to revisit and reuse over millennia in this circumstance. Here's examples of having some of these same kinds of tools cached inside pits, or the remains of pits. And they're also maintaining their flake foam toolkit, their hunting toolkit on site. It's present to a limited extent. It's not a primary site activity. The plant collection and processing is in this circumstance. But with that said, we still have examples of middle and late archaic dark points. Like these Chiricahua points, which is named after the mountain range in southeastern Arizona by I want to say Sales and Antis, but I'm blanking right now. These are the most numerous, and these go with those early big round structures I showed earlier on. They're contemporary. This is a common dark point form used during the Middle Archaic in the low desert regions of present-day Arizona. You have these other dark point forms preserved at the site. San Pedro being quite common. Cortero, your Hohokam points in this circumstance, very few. I think we only had maybe 2 or 3. This is an example of what Howard classified as Snaketown stem from his excavations at the Snaketown site. I think what you have here is probably, these are representing parts of tasks or family groups bringing their hunting toolkit on site primarily for use elsewhere, and this stuff is being cached and inadvertently abandoned or somehow lost on site over the millennia is being used. I don't think the hunting is necessarily taking place on site as much as it is surrounding it. This is just an overview of part of the excavation near its end. This is we're in the south part of the 44 acres south of that munitions road that is used to transport things to and from the flight line. And this is looking, actually I'm backward here. That last one was looking to the north. This is looking to the south because here's one of those salt domes. Right back there. And this is near what we call project closeout. I do want to talk about that term. Thus far, we've been focused on identifying and excavating and sampling the remains of structures, their foundations, associated extramural pits of various kinds and other features in the areas in and around the remains of the structures. There were some human burials at this site. Only 3. And before we went shovels down, if you will, and in accordance with the project memorandum of agreement, the data recovery plan, and consultation with the tribes, the SHPO, the Air Force, all the signatories, we came back in with those, the combination of hand tools, but also those excavators and backhoes, and still stripped this down further to ensure that that entire footprint, after we were done with it, we had made a good faith effort to clear it of human remains and associated funerary objects as a part of the archaeological work and before the construction of the solar. So that was done throughout this entire 44-acre footprint. When this was completed, the mechanical stripping was on the order of about 370,000 cubic meters. There are some gigantic stockpiles that unfortunately aren't in these photos. We had to continue to coordinate with the flight line on about operations and safety. This is the final excavation plan map. I mean, at this scale, to show it on single figures, I apologize for all the little itty bitty dots, but these are best sent out to plotters where they're like 4 by 6 foot maps up on a wall. These are the 3,065 features shown in the southern area here on the right, northern area on the left. At excavation's end. Structures are, the remains of structures are shown in the red. There's a midden area up here in this like darker maroon or purple. And the rest of these much smaller features are pits of various kinds, storage pits, cooking pits, remains of occupational surfaces where we think we've actually
found the eroded remains of the surface people were actually using and standing on and living at specific points in time. This is the final project chronology as constructed from radiocarbon dates. We were able to obtain 92 radiocarbon dates, all of which were accelerator mass spectrometry. And this graph is kind of showing the radiocarbon results in 4 different ways. I want to focus primarily on the gray shading, which is showing the radiocarbon ages over time from around 3300 BC over here on the left. And as these gray areas get taller, we've got more dates. And if the number of dates for a specific time is used as a proxy for the intensity of site use, which is kind of what's constructed to show, then the site was most intensively used based on this data. First, starting around 3000 BC to about 2300 BC. Use and occupation declines, but continues to a lesser extent, to about 1800 BC. We have nothing for about 300 years. It doesn't mean that the site wasn't occupied. We still have a radiocarbon date from those 3,000 features that fills that hole, but there's certainly a decline in the use of the site during that time period. And then all of a sudden, starting at around 1400 BC, which gets us to that San Pedro late Archaic time frame, which is very much better understood in southern Arizona. You see relatively intensive, prolonged use of the site. This is the beginnings of maize agriculture in southern Arizona. In earnest. It starts back here at 2100 BC, but it really starts taking off right in here, this San Pedro Cienega transition. These are the archaeological period and phase names and how they correspond with these ages up here on the top. So we're going to Chiricahua, San Pedro Cienega. We get a little bit of pre-classic Hohokam, a short, brief, punctuated use during the early pre-classic. That's often, some people have called that the salubrious sedentary period. Sedentary and pre-classic are kind of synonymous in the Hohokam culture history terminology, but between about 900 and 1100, you see the Hohokam build settlement, non-riverine settlements in areas they hadn't occupied previously. You have these gigantic ball court sites and pit house sites in places like Florence Military Reservation, many miles away from the Gila and Salt Rivers and the waterways. They're able to successfully dryland farm for multiple generations, building immense settlements during the pre-classic period. That stops abruptly around 1150 with contraction of that population back to the major riverways at the onset of the classic period. That's probably a combination of social and environmental factors, because that's also when the Hohokam stop cremating their dead. They transition from cremating their dead to inhumations. They stop making red on red water or anything. Start making a lot of redwares. And you transition from ball court network to platform now. There's a societal, cosmological, worldview shift that takes place all at the same time, that pre-classic, classic transition. That's not what this site's largely about, but just a little bit of the context for the larger basin. And the very tail end, and it's good to see this. It's hard to find it. It's a consequence of having the privilege to dig such a great big contiguous area completely. Is we do have 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th century features in that project area. So I mean, you're talking just right before the entrada, right before the Spanish. So the proto-historic record is also preserved there. So It's another way to look at that, look at time and when the site was occupied using archaeological terminology. But these are the different temporal components, transitional intervals, like that classic proto-historic would be one. We've got Cienega to Red Mountain, and then San Pedro, Cienega is represented. We have these specific dated episodes amongst the house groups and associated pits. So this long-term use of this landform. So to kind of wrap up, we've got this gigantic 44-acre excavation. It's got a record of 5,000 years of indigenous land use, various intensities and purposes. But at the same time, there's a remarkable amount of stability. Whether it's 3000 BC or AD 600, it looks like what people are primarily doing there is the collection and processing of mesquite in a dry, non-riverine setting. And they're doing that intermittently for almost 7,000 years. That's a tremendous testament to a highly successful lifeway in the Sonoran Desert. I mean, that worked. That worked whether you're a Middle Archaic hunter-gatherer, early agriculturalist at 2100 BC, or you're a Hohokam or Hohokam family or Oda. That's represented in that footprint and dated intermittently over those 7,000 years. They continue those same activities up here at present-day Luke Air Force Base in the face of dramatic changes in the U.S. Southwest. At 2100 BC, you have the beginnings of maize agriculture and canal irrigation maize agriculture on the floodplains of southern Arizona. That's happening while they continue to use that location in essentially the same way. They continue to use that location the same way after the regular use of ceramic containers starting at around AD 100, because ceramics are not regularly used for utilitarian purposes, cooking, transport, storage, until about 81. You have modeled clay figurines, low-fired ceramic artifacts and objects, but they're not utilitarian objects. I mean, they're not for cooking and transport and storage. You have settled village life, to where you're starting to see, when you start to see multiple nuclear and also extended families occupying farmsteads and hamlets and villages starting at 8300 throughout southern and central Arizona. They continue to visit that same footprint, using it in the same way. And again, there's no substantial changes that we can infer from the archaeological evidence, what's preserved there, over that 7,000 years, and all those major technological and societal changes along the way. Same kinds of structures and tools were built. I want to emphasize again with the Hohokam, I mean, starting at AD 600, the Hohokam had constructed North America's largest canal irrigation network in present-day Phoenix Basin, had nearly 40,000 hectares under cultivation at the same time. It's a tremendous engineering feat. That's happening, and they continue to use that footprint at the same time. It's a testament to the veracity of that adaptation, for lack of a better word. Lastly, I kind of started off on, kind of sound like a realtor, location. But one of the reasons we think that site was there and people were using that location the way they did for so long, again, was because you're at that distal Bajada coming off the white tanks, sediments are being impeded by the salt domes, that's promoted the bosque setting. That doesn't occur at only that location here in the West Valley. That setting is repeated in several other locations between the base and the Gila River as you proceed southward. So the report does include a predictive model for locations we suspect a very similar archaeological record is preserved, representing the same kind of activities and lifeways for that essentially same period of time elsewhere here in the West Valley. I do want to note that the project reports, it's a 2-volume report. It is technical. I think there are parts of it, though, like the summaries are pretty accessible. Those are free for download from the SRI Press website. You can download those as PDFs. That's part of the public outreach component of the project. This is just a parting shot of this is some of the crew at the right before site closure. And this is that munitions road that runs through the middle of the site. Within about, I want to say 9 months after we completed our field work, it was a year. Within a year of our completing our field work, a solar array was built and turned on and is operational. At the location of the solar array along Super Sabre Avenue, which is the road that flanks it on the north that proceeds from Southgate to the flight line, there is a self-interpretive information kiosk. It also provides a project summary. There's like a multi-use path that I think kind of goes around the solar array that a lot of the airmen use for jogging, walking, etc. The collection, where'd all the stuff go? The collection, all the artifacts and the remaining samples are currently curated at the Gila Bend Air Force Auxiliary Field, which is about 5 miles south of Gila Bend. The staff at Luke Air Force Base, who oversaw a lot of SRI's work in civil engineering, I do want to pay recognition to now retired Jeff Rothrock. He was the civil engineering environmental flight chief at the time of the project. He strived mightily to help support and facilitate the project over its 6-year run from 2009 to 2015. I also would like to thank the tribal representatives who chose to share their understanding on how and interpretation of some of the project findings, and which were very instrumental concerning the use of the Bosque environment, these non-riverine distal Bajada locations. And I also want to thank all of you, of course, for taking the time out of your lives. A lot of time is precious to listen to me share this with you today. And to Lisa, thank you for helping make this possible, and for the center. And if you have any questions, I hope to try and answer. Yes, sir.
You said that all the artifacts are down in Gila Bend. Are they available, or is there curation there? Somebody that can explain what they are, and can you go in and look at it?
In concept, yes. It's not like a working museum per se. It's a curator, and what I mean by that is there's not somebody there all the time in that it would fulfill that capacity. It's essentially a curation facility. It's a storage facility that meets the federal requirements to house archaeological collections, and it doesn't house only this collection, but anything that's been collected from the Berry and Goldwater Range, both east and west. So they've got stuff from the Marine Corps administered side too. With that said, there's nothing stopping anyone from the public contacting Luke Air Force Base, asking permission to be provided access to that collection for research or other appropriate purposes. I would direct you to the 56th, and I can write this down for you, but I would direct you to the 56th Range Management Office, Public Affairs specialist. Her name is Darlene Seltman. She's stationed here. Well, she's not stationed. She's civilian. She works up here at Luke Air Force Base. That curation facility is administered by the 56R. Yes, sir.
Did the Hopi make any claims on any of this period of time?
They were a consulting party. They provided feedback in terms of review of the data recovery plans, the implementation of the project, but they did not make any claims of patrimony in terms of the repatriation of the human remains or individual parts of the collection. Salt River, Pima Maricopa Indian Community fulfilled that role in consultation with the other tribes.
Yeah.
Yes.
What species of trees were used for the poles?
Mesquite, Palo Verde, and ironwood for the construction of the walls of the houses. Yeah, it's a locally available trees. So it's one of the reasons I think there's kind of a limitation on the size of a Hohokam floor plan is the timber involved in terms of how much of a roof you can, an enclosed roof you can actually have or need. You don't have access to big pine timbers without a whole lot.
Were you able to extrapolate numbers of people using the facility in those various periods of usage?
I can only do that in very general terms. I would say throughout the history of its occupation, it's probably being visited by nuclear families. That's probably the unit that's occupying it. When houses are being built and occupied, we're probably looking at several nuclear families at one point in time. Extended families potentially later in the sequence. But I would think it's probably on the order of, never on the order beyond tens of people. Because again, we've got 7,000 years that this archaeological record, these house foundations and these pits and these artifacts are being deposited at that location. So that, and given that they continue to come back to essentially the same footprint, it would not take a large number of people to produce what we found, given the immense amount of time that's represented.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Prior to the dedication of this land to the Air Force Base in 1941, this area was all controlled by Southwest Cotton Company. In your initial pedestrian walks and as you stripped the site, was there evidence that this was farmed in the 19th century?
We didn't encounter a plow zone during our mechanical stripping. In other words, we didn't find evidence of historical or modern agriculture, or fields. Yeah, we didn't encounter a plow zone.
Okay, thanks.
Now, that doesn't mean there wasn't one there that's been scraped away as a part of whatever land clearance was done to construct the base. That part, you may understand better than I do, but I would imagine they would have leveled a very large footprint around that flight line as a part of constructing it. Just in terms of the earth moving required to put that flight line.
The stone tools that you said were brought were not made. Did you determine what the source of or the likely source of those were?
I think they're probably they're gravels and cobbles from the Agua Fria and the Gila. That would be the first place that would I think is likely, followed by the Bajada of the white tanks, the surrounding major washes where you've got lags. But yeah, they're mainly alluvial cobbles. They're river cobbles have been brought in, shaped, intentionally shaped, and then used, or the shaping as a result of the use.
Where were all the canals that they were noted for building?
There were no prehistoric canals in this project area. The canal networks I was referencing were for the Hohokam systems off of the Salt and the Gila rivers, like Canal Systems 1 and 2 So that's back in the Phoenix Basin proper to our east primarily. A lot of the present day canals in Greater Phoenix are modern versions of the Hoh canals. Because historically, a lot of the primary canals were still visible, ran for kilometers at grade. So the Euro-American settlers of what we call Phoenix availed themselves.
Was there any evidence of water, like wells, and where they would have water access?
No, we didn't have any walk-in wells on this one that we were able to identify. I think they're probably relying on surface water, and if I had to put a seasonality on the occupation of the site, I'd probably put it in correspondence with when the mesquite beans are present. So I think it's kind of monsoonal.
So as you were stripping and whatnot, were the spoils sifted, or you just had someone there with?
That stripping process was monitored by, we had two people. For each of those excavators, there were two people dedicated to observing that stripping process the entire time it was ongoing. If you had like a matade or an artifact or potsherds exposed as a part of the stripping, their locations would be marked with the pin flag. The artifacts collected, the location mapped, and then the stripping would proceed. But there's undoubtedly artifacts that ended up in the backfill. You're not going to see everything. It's impossible to do a complete recovery with these methods, particularly 44 acres. But I would, with that said, I would say we gathered the vast bulk of everything that was preserved. And again, that's stored down there south of Gila Bend in that Air Force facility currently. Yes, sir.
I have a thought. So what was the average size of your, I know everything's worded pretty carefully here, of your artifacts, probably Matadi would be, everyone would be getting excited about, or an animal. So did you have anything of really any size or really any pots?
We had matadis and mortars that were 2.5 feet, and maximum dimension weighing 70, 80, 90, 110 pounds. Some of the big ones. We had some reconstructible vessels, ceramic pots, come off the floors of a couple of the houses that date the Hoh use of the site. But most of the artifacts are this size and smaller. And when you get to the flake stone debris from making and using stone tools like dart points, knives, scrapers, choppers, things of that nature, you're talking about things the size of quarters, dimes, nickels.
My last question, what was the total cost?
$9.1 million. Over 4 fiscal years.
Were there any ball courts found on this site?
No, this is not a primary Hoh village.
Okay.
The only communal architecture here, would be that one very large circular pit structure, but that's about 4,500 years older than some of the earliest ball courts.
Was that structure in a later period or the mid period?
Let's go to that. This one?
Yeah.
This big one here is right around 3,000 BC.
2000.
3,000 BC. It's about 5,000. It's a little more than 5,000 years old.
So do you think the population decreased over the millennium?
No, it undoubtedly increased.
Did you find anything?
It increased.
Oh,
Did that answer your question?
yes, thank you.
One more.
So I'm the same at that time as it is today.
I'm sorry.
Was the climate, was this desert as hot today as it gets here from that?
It was clearly Upper Sonoran Desert as it is. Yes, it was Upper Sonoran Desert, the same vegetation that's the native vegetation that's present today. Well, thank you, everyone.